next panel that is sponsored by IGC, which is on institutions and their design for industrialization. And this panel will be moderated by Dr. Abel Kinyondo. But before the panel begins, I'm not going to be like Lant and go like, let's stretch. I'm just going to say, can we kindly move forward? And then I'm going to ask Professor John Sutton, Professor Eric Verhoogen, Professor Francois Bourguignon, and Professor Lant Pritchett, kindly move forward and take your spots. That most of you are able to attend these 2 days. You've been participating actively, and we're really grateful to the support that we've received from the EU delegation. And for this particular panel, we are really, really thankful to IGC that have sponsored to bring some of the participants all the way from the UK, some from Nairobi. Yesterday, we are really grateful to CRDB and CBA Bank who have supported this conference. But over the years, whenever you hear the word IGC, or you hear we work a lot with IGC, we work a lot with SOAS, we work a lot with Open University, in a way, DFID is not mentioned explicitly, but they've been supporting. So also a really big thank you to DFID for continually supporting discussions and also analytical work all over the world. Abel, as the chair of this session, I welcome. The floor is to you.
Thank you, Blandina. Thank you, everyone, for coming for this, to this session. We have been talking about institutions since yesterday, and we want to get into the depth of it right now. And with me, I have professors, 4 of them, Sutton, Eric, Lant, and Francois. Hopefully, we are going to use as short time as possible so that we can have more time from the floor. So I'm expecting a lot of questions coming from yesterday till today. If you have them, please prepare for that. Professor Sutton, we have been talking about institutions, and can we now assume that if we have institutions, everything is fine, and we have industrialization and we have development? Is that what you have been saying?
No, I would say that that's the beginning of a process rather than the end. In fact, there's a single theme, a single message that we on this panel would like to communicate, and we're going to do it by coming in from a number of different angles. The easiest way to see the message that we'd like to convey is to ask yourself, how is it that governments and people around government often talk about what they have to do in the process of industrialization? And very often the emphasis is on things like investment incentives. Very often the emphasis is on rules of certain percentages in local content. And we want to talk about the limits of rules and regulations and laws. They all have a place, they need to be there. But often getting results in areas like foreign direct investment or in maximizing the number of jobs created when you have an oil industry are the business of active agency. And if you don't have active agencies in place that do their job, that do the hard work of making things happen, then you don't get results. Now, in my experience, there are 2 agencies of government that we should begin by talking about, because they're at the coalface of the central question: how do we generate the most jobs in this country from foreign direct investment experience? And we have 2 kinds of foreign companies. We have the general manufacturing multinationals who could go to Kenya tomorrow or Ethiopia, and for them, yes, getting business conditions right is very important. There's another kind of multinational, natural resource multinationals, the oil companies. They can't go elsewhere because the oil is here. Bargaining power of government is much different there. relations can be shaped in a different way. And so we have two agencies of government, which in all industrialized countries play a leading role at the coalface in interacting between government sector and private sector. The first is the Investment Authority. Their job is, the job of the TIC in this country, is to ensure that foreign companies coming to the country have a good operating environment. And what does that mean in practice? Well, in practice, it means something very simple, but something which requires hard work to achieve. And that is that they will inevitably be tripped up with problems. Problems of power supply, problems of land ownership, problems of logistics and customs. And they need help in circumventing unnecessary and inappropriate obstacles that stand in their way. A good investment agency, we know from practice around the world, involves active relationship building with companies. It involves having a team within the agency that specialize in different sectors, that get to know the companies, and that operate in a regular, routine fashion. In fact, if there's one thing, I've worked with the TIC here, I've worked for 5 years with the investment agency in Ethiopia, and the main thing you're trying to achieve is regularity of process. There's a monthly meeting. All the issues with the companies come on the table. Decisions are made as to what the next action to be taken is and who's going to take it. The following month, everything is gone through again. Did the action get taken? Was there a result? If not, what? What next action should we take? That sounds simple. It sounds so obvious, it's hardly worth saying. And yet it's not what normally happens in many investment agencies around the world. Very often they're driven to putting out fires. There's an emergency here, there's an emergency there. To avoid that culture of endlessly running around putting out fires, you have rules and procedures. You anticipate problems. You deal with the problem at an early stage before it becomes critical. That's how a good investment agency works, and the formula is called relationship building. There's no secret. People know that's how to do things properly. But you need a very determined head of the agency to create the culture where that becomes the normal way of doing business. That's building the institution properly, making it work. The other kind of institution I work with is local content. I've been working with Ms. Bengissa and her colleagues in local content unit here, indeed in shaping it where it stands for some years. At the moment, I'm working for the finance ministers of the EAC, trying to get coordination in this area across the various member countries. What kind of challenges do we face? What should a local content unit do? Well, here is a very dramatic example of where governments go wrong. There are many pitfalls. Most countries do it badly. Some countries do it brilliantly. The pitfalls you have to avoid begin with pitfall number one. And pitfall number one is don't imagine that rules and regulations will do the job. The favorite rule and regulation is let's have a big law. Let's require them to have 30% local content. Let's require them to have 40% local content. Frankly, when countries do that, nothing happens. The countries that have succeeded brilliantly, have done so by means of active negotiation. You need to have a small unit in government, a local content unit. Members of that unit need to be good professionals who can deal with companies. They need to do their homework. They need to understand the multinationals, because some multinationals are remarkably well disposed towards building up local content. Others are relatively indifferent to the agenda. Then you've got to know your local companies. If you want to have a successful negotiation, you've got to be realistic and knowledgeable. You've got to know what is feasible, what local companies could be brought up to speed to enter into the supply chain of this multinational. The opportunities are endless. They begin with construction. They go through retail services, general business services. They extend through to engineering services over a well-understood time scale of 3 years. Local companies can be brought up to speed. Once the institutional arrangements are in place, you can have training of local companies so that companies can apply for training. The training is done over an 18-month period, then they become qualified vendors. After that, you have an open and fair tender process where there are tenders to bid for contracts to supply. So you put the institutional structure in place. But the hard work is inevitable. The difference between success and failure lies in those negotiations. They need to be realistic, balanced, well-informed. But results can be got. There's no substitute for actually doing the work. I think this brings me directly into a general observation, which Lant was talking about yesterday, and will now talk about again from this angle.
Lant, do you want to take it from there quickly?
Sure. So as you see that this is building on the theme of sort of the practicalities, and that sort of having abstract rules per se isn't really the issue. You actually need performance capability. So I want to talk about three metaphors around performance capability brought into the government sector. Because, again, the question isn't sort of who can create the right forms or the right appearances, but who can actually deliver performance. So there's three things. First, I want to start with a metaphor of starfish versus spiders. And this is a metaphor about how organizations conceive themselves and work. The spider thinks of itself as all the decision making is concentrated in a single place. And the web exists solely to feed the spider. All the information gathered by the web as to what might be in it, what might be caught, is transmitted to the spider. The spider then allocates, makes decisions and allocates, I'm going to go out and respond to this, respond to that. All the decision making is at the center. The rest of the organization exists to feed the spider. That, by and large, is often the way in which Weberian bureaucracies, the typical government organization, is conceived. It's a spider. It's a hierarchical organization whose job is to transmit information up and transmit informations down. Now, almost exactly the opposite sort of is the starfish. The starfish actually has no brain. There is no central nervous system of a starfish. The starfish doesn't move because the brain decides to move. The starfish moves because the tentacles, each of them, are searching out favorable opportunities, where the food is. And if a bunch of tentacles on one side of the starfish are finding food and want to move that way, they pull the starfish towards the food. They're entirely performance-driven at the local level, so the starfish doesn't move because the starfish decides to move. The starfish moves because the elements of the starfish seek performance and move it. Right? So if you want institutions in the government sector that interface successfully with a dynamic private sector, you're going to have to think in a much more starfish way. Much more autonomous action, much more performance-driven, rather than in the typical rules and compliance-driven modality that some people think of as a good institution in the civil service vein. So, and the beauty of a starfish is if you take a starfish and you cut it into 5 bits, you get 5 starfish. Because it wasn't centrally controlled, weakness at the center isn't completely paralyzing and debilitating. So that's the first metaphor, spiders versus starfish. And when people discuss institutions, they often have in their mind that the ideal is a spider. If we just had, a strong leader who gave strong directions and everybody just did exactly what they were told. Whereas if you listen to John describe how investment companies work, it's a much more responsive modality, which is the second sort of metaphor, which is animals have camouflage. They have camouflage so that they can, if they're predators, so that the prey doesn't see them, and if they're prey, they have camouflage so the predators don't see them. A lot of what organizations do in the public sector is camouflage. They pretend to look like organizations that work in the hopes that that enables them to survive. Sociologists have a name for this. They call it isomorphism. If I just try and look like a post office, and my post office workers wear a post office uniform, and they go to a building that looks like a post office, kind of whether they deliver the mail isn't really that important. They're the camouflage of a post office. So a huge amount of government organizations around the world are the camouflage of a government organization. They have the same organograms, they have the same titles, but they have none of the underlying drive for functional performance. So a lot of what counts for institutional reform is adopting forms of institutions that are pure camouflage. They have nothing to do with the actual performance of the organization. They just enhance organizational survival by pretending to look like organizations that work. So a lot of what it's going to take to create performance-driven organizations is to sabotage the camouflage, is to reveal things by their function, not by their form, and not be satisfied with form and formulaic reform. The third thing, and I'm trying to hold strictly to 10 minutes, because the third thing is, so I have different lines of research. Yesterday I talked a lot about what I do with respect to economic growth, but I just published a book with co-authors on how to build state capability. So once you decide that we want to do something, how do we build the capability to do it? And our fundamental, and by the way, the book is available online, open access, anybody can download it for free, so there's no commercial interest in this. Matter of fact, there's the opposite of commercial interest. We had to pay the press in order for them to make it available for free, so it's available for free. I'm not slogging the book for profit motive. You can download it for free. The fundamental sort of modality in what we recommend to build organizational capability is called problem-driven iterative adaptation, which is exactly what John Sutton, independently of ever having read my book, described of how functional organizations work. They identify problems, they identify potential solutions, they attempt to put those solutions into a place, they get rapid feedback about whether those solutions are working, and if they're not working, they change, they do something else, they identify the obstacles to success. But the key thing starts with problem-driven. If an organization can't specify with some clarity exactly what the problem is that they're trying to solve, and that they have what we call authorization to solve, that is, the stakeholders in this space have said to the organization, you are authorized to go ahead and solve this problem, you can't generate success. So we think a lot of, and again, I still admit that I don't know what an institution means, but I know what an organization means. Because an organization, I can find it at an address and I can give it budgets and stuff. So this is about developing the capability of organizations. And again, as yesterday, the policies you have matter almost not at all compared to the capability of the organizations you deploy to implement those policies. So the key to any sort of success is going to be, do we have a strategy for building the capability that's appropriate to the task that we have? If you're dealing with a purely logistical task, building a post office-like structure might work, but for the kinds of things that are going to make a relevant difference to an industrial-led growth in Tanzania, you're going to have to think that the organization is going to have to create capabilities that will make it look much more like a starfish, and will have to be performance-driven, not compliance-driven. It will have to be a very different kind of approach to building capability. And we think the kind of approach we outline in our book about problem-driven iterative adaptation will be well adapted to building the capability of the organizations to do the tasks that are required in order for the government to be a productive part of promoting industrial-led growth.
Thank you, Lant. And I'm seeing a lot of similarity between what you're saying and Sutton, that we need agencies that are adaptive, we need active participation and active relationship, leadership should be there so that we can get there, and it's not about the form, but functions, and that's what we have to look at. Francois, if I may bring you in, is it, or was it Eric? Yeah, Eric, if I may bring you in now, is it a matter of one thing over the other? Are we saying now that we need functions, we don't necessarily need policies and rules, or do we have to strike a certain balance that both of them work and they're interdependent?
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, so I'm going to take up this theme that form is not sufficient, that there needs to be active intervention. In my case, the application is going to be learning in firms and industrial policy. I would actually like, my slides would be useful. There's some certain visuals I'd like to put up, so if you put up the slides and bring the clicker to the people over there, that would be great. I'll start speaking. Okay, so there's the traditional view of industrial policy is that certain sectors generate more learning, and, sort of dynamic learning externalities automatically, I would say. There's certain sectors are more inherently given to generating learning than others. Some of that learning, as I said, is external, so firms on their own are going to underinvest in it, and therefore the appropriate role of industrial policy is to subsidize those sectors or promote them in some way in order to increase the overall role of growth. That tends to lead to the policy implication that what governments need to do is just get a certain type of sector that's generating that learning. Get an auto sector, or get an electronic sector, or get a steel sector, and that will be sufficient in order to bring about growth. So what I think we're learning from some of this work, a clicker would be useful also. I think what we're learning from some of recent work on learning within firms is that learning is not automatic. That's too simple a view. There's a clicker up there? It was up there for me yesterday. There's the, oh, there, okay, here we go, okay. Right, so I think what we're learning from some of this recent work on learning within firms is that, sorry, oops, I don't know which direction to point my clicker. Exactly the same problem. Yeah, okay. The machine's over there. Over there, okay, we'll go, okay. But it's slow. It's slow, I see, okay. Maybe, can you help me click forward? I'm going closely. I'm skipping over some stuff. So learning's not automatic. We need to think carefully about the circumstances in which learning happens and doesn't happen. Because we've cut down, I have less time than I thought I was going to have. I'm just going to give two examples, one from my own work and one from some other work, about the way that learning may fail to happen. Okay, so if we can keep clicking. Okay, so here's the story. This is work we were doing in soccer ball production in Sialkot, Pakistan. Nobody in Pakistan plays soccer. Nonetheless, it's a world center of soccer ball production. And the story here is through a series of fortuitous events, which I'll describe briefly, we came up with a new technology which was strictly better for essentially all firms in the sector. And we gave it out in an experiment, and then we found, much to our surprise, that firms did not take it up. And so we are sort of understanding why that is, and it has to do with institutions basically within the firm about why they didn't take it up. So this is a cutter who's cutting, he's cutting hexagons here. He's bringing a hydraulic press down on a metal die, which is cutting hexagons. If we go to the next slide, let's see if that works. Yeah, you all know that a standard soccer ball design has hexagons and pentagons. Those are the traditional dies that they were using. You did not know that, so there you go. You're not a soccer fan. I'm sure here in
few Americans in the audience.
Right.
Oh, that's a football.
In East Africa, people are going to be more familiar with this basic design. Trying again. Okay. Hexagons they're easy to cut out of these rectangular sheets of artificial leather in a way that minimizes waste. So as you can see, there's an example. Hexagons tessellate. You can tile a plane with hexagons. Pentagons you cannot tile a plane with pentagons. They do not tessellate, and so it's inherently a more difficult problem. And in fact, what they had been doing in Sialkot before we got there was imitating the hexagon cutting pattern with their pentagon dies. So this is an example. This is a picture of this sheet of artificial leather after pentagons have been cut out of it. You can see there's quite a bit of those little triangles. There's quite a bit of waste here, much more than with the hexagons. It turns out that is not the optimal cutting design. I happen to be watching a video of a Chinese factory. This is a still, if it comes up. This is a still from a Chinese video that was also cutting, a factory that was also cutting pentagons for a different reason. Also involved in soccer balls, using a different design than the one that we knew was happening in Sialkot, Pakistan. Turns out there was There was a math paper in 1990 that showed this. Mathematicians have known this for a long time. This is the optimal cutting design. You can also now, you could double check this in real time if you like on your laptops. Pull up Wikipedia and type in Pentagon. And you scroll down, you'll see that picture there of the purple and blue pentagons. So that's a way of fitting more pentagons into a plane than could be designed. And so my wife and I, who's an architect, we sat down on AutoCAD and drew this. I'm trying to. Every time I do this, maybe someone can forward it. There, we got this. We figured out that we could fit more pentagons into a rectangle than was there before. So there's a die that implements that design, which is different from the die we had before. So that's the die that we gave out. And this is just a brief thumbnail, very quick nutshell summary. Is we gave it out. A few firms adopted it, including one very large firm in town that's producing for Nike, it's sort of the second largest firm in town, has more than 1,000 employees. But many firms, most of the firms we gave it to, did not. And so then we started asking firms, why not, what was going on? And it turned out that the workers, the cutters, that first picture I showed you, didn't like it. Why? Those cutters are paid piece rates. They have no incentive to reduce waste. And our new die was slowing them down, certainly while they're learning how to use it, and they were worried about being slowed down forever. And so even though the gains from reduction of waste of this main material were much larger, or of magnitude larger than any increase in labor time, the workers were not seeing those gains. All the gains were accruing to the owners, and their incomes were going down, and so they were blocking it. They were figuring out ways to prevent the owners from adopting, partly by telling the owners that this was a bad technology, partly by other reasons. For other reasons. And so what we did, the second experiment, we decided we're going to give the workers a month's salary as a lump sum bonus if they'll reveal to their owners essentially that the technology works. We did that, and a bunch of firms adopted. Okay, so that's sort of, I guess, partly to proof that this organizational barrier really was what was getting in the way. What's the point of telling that whole story here in this case? And the answer is learning is not automatic, right? You need institutions, you think of that as informal contracting institutions within the firm. In this case, if there were a better way, if there were a way that workers would be convinced that they would share in the gains from productivity improvement, then we would have had more adoption of this technology. It's sort of a clear case, I think, of that happening. So we need to think about circumstances under which that sort of learning can happen, okay? So my second example, let's forward ahead a few slides, please. Okay, now it's going. Okay, my second example would be a paper that's not from me, but it's from a couple of my co-authors, David Atkin and Amit Khandawal, and someone named Adam Osman, which was an experiment they did in Egypt with rug producers. Okay? And there what they did is they convinced a buyer of rugs, a European buyer of rugs, to randomize initial export contacts. So among a large number, I forget the exact number, a large number of Egyptian rug producers, to some of them they said, okay, here's one contract to produce a rug for this buyer, and then they did hands off and we won't intervene further. So what happened? So that was quite good for those firms. Those firms did export more, they were more profitable. They also, I don't know if you can read that, they also improved quality on a number of dimensions. They were exposed to this demanding foreign buyer who was catering to tastes of consumers in rich countries. And so on various dimensions, this is corners, waviness, weight, touch, packedness is sort of a density of the rug. These producers improve the quality. Okay, and not only did they improve the quality, but they actually became more productive as a consequence. So you can look here. This is these tables are showing the intent to treat effects and the treatment on the treated effects. Just sort of a summary table. All those are just saying that the treatment of this initial export contact had a positive effect, both on quality and on just sort of basic objective measures of productivity, the accuracy of the length, the accuracy of the weight, et cetera, without taking more time. So what's the message there is that for some reason exporting and exposure demanding foreign buyers seems to have salutary effects on firms, both because they upgrade the quality, and also because that seems to involve learning. Okay, so that's the other dimension, which I've skipped over, but which I also think is important, has been emphasized by other people in this literature, is competition. So there's various examples where a lack of competition can lead to stagnation and lead to firms sort of not realizing productivity gains, even though such gains seem to be available. Okay, so that's my summary. Learning is not automatic. It's not just a question, I guess how it relates to what John and Lant were saying, it's not just a question of having an agency with the right name. It's not just a question of having rules or laws on the books. It doesn't just happen on its own. There has to be active effort in order to encourage learning. There's several sort of factors that seem to promote learning. One would be contracts, in quote I'm saying, so it could be formal contracts or informal contracts that encourage information sharing within the firm, which don't always exist and didn't exist in Pakistan. Competition seems to have a positive effect on productivity, and also exporting and exposure to demanding foreign consumers seems to have these positive effects. Okay, with that I'll pass it on.
Francois.
I would on my side, very much rely on my experience when I was in the World Bank. And I would like to start with the following experience, which is the fact that in my days, still in my days, at least at the beginning in the World Bank, one word which was almost prohibited, which was almost a bad word, was industrial policy. When you were saying that maybe a country should develop its industrial policy to reach this and this goal, then many people in the bank would say, no, this is wrong. The only kind of industrial policy that you may have is doing business kind. Make sure that the environment for business is okay, that there is the right infrastructure, that it is very easy to get a construction permit, that you can create a business in a few days, and then everything will be okay. But if you try to do anything else, if you try to substitute to the initiative of the private sector, if you in any way prevent the private sector to operate in the way market is suggesting, or the profit is suggesting they should operate, then you will be going to the wall. It is interesting to see that this attitude has dramatically changed over the recent years. And today, industrial policy is not anymore a bad word, but at the same time, we don't really know exactly what is industrial policy. What we know that many countries, including countries which today are the most developed in the world, all of them used at some stage industrial policies, in the sense that they simply ignored they didn't rely essentially on the market. They were discretionary in pushing some activities forward. And we have seen that in the United States in the 19th century, as we have seen it in Korea over the 20th century. And if you have not read this book, I really recommend you that you read this book by Ellis Amsden about the history of Korean development. And you'll see exactly the way in which it was possible for Korea to industrialize, starting from a situation which in the 1960s was very, very similar to the way in which African countries were right at the time of the independence. So today, it is okay that industrial policies is a word that we can use. Now the problem is, what exactly do we want to put under that word? Now, the main point here is to say that for many reasons, we know that markets do not function always properly. There are many market failures. And to a large extent in developing countries and in those countries which would like to industrialize, and this is the topic of this workshop, then we know that there are sunk costs to be paid in order to penetrate some markets. We know that there are economies of scale. We know that there are externalities of different type. We know that there are externalities across firms, as it was just said. And because of that, we know that automatically this will not be the result of the initiative of a private firm. So there needs to be some kind of intervention. Now, there are different types of intervention. One is to regulate the way in which the market functions, to help develop some sectors, to get rid or to internalize externalities. Another type of policies to develop the infrastructure that will be appropriate to exploit some kind of comparative advantage that does exist in the country. And all this is under the umbrella of industrial policies and under the umbrella of regulatory authorities and industrial development agencies. Now, I think that we all agree with the fact that this is necessary. This has proved to be necessary in the past. It is necessary today. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that, is it the case that everything goes? Is it the case that it goes through the mind of somebody responsible for this kind of industrial development agency to invest or to push investment or private firms in some direction by some kind of subsidy or investing in some kind of infrastructure? Certainly not. It is certainly not the case that everything goes. We know that there will be mistakes being made, but we know that there will be also successes being obtained. The main point here is that, and this is a link that I want to make with institutions, the main point here is to say that those agencies must behave according to some rules, some principles, and must be given the independence that they need in relation with governments. They must be given a precise objective. They must be given some precise rules of the game, and within this set of rules, this set of institutions, truly in the right sense of the word, then these agencies must be responsible for the industrial development. And one of the big issues that we observe, and that we have observed in the past with quote-unquote industrial policies, is precisely that those policies were not under the responsibility of agencies which were behaving in that way, with no rules being set, or possibly the rules being set not being followed. So my point would be to insist on the fact that industrial policies is not anymore a bad word. It is something which is absolutely necessary, certainly at the stage of industrialization, but this needs to be embedded in the right institutions, in effective institutions.
Thank you, Francois, for that very candid argument that we, after all, may need government intervention in some areas. Lant, you want to come in?
I think Francois is making the point that industrial policy is being revisited, but I think it's being revisited having learned the lessons of the past. The difference between Africa and Korea wasn't that Africa didn't have industrial policy and Korea did, right? It was that most African countries did. I mean, in Tanzania in particular, you had a very aggressive industrial policy. So the difference wasn't Korea had one and Tanzania didn't. It was, were they able to actually implement in a productive way the industrial policy they had? So I work at the Kennedy School, where Danny Roderick and Ricardo Hausmann make me two of the most powerful intellectual forces in rehabilitating the words industrial policy. And the debate we always sort of have at the Kennedy School is, what kind of industrial policy do you want in a country that can't give driver's licenses without corruption? Like we saw in your earlier slides, that one of the most important problems in Tanzania is perceived corruption. Okay, now you want discretionary activity of the type you would call industrial policy. Okay, that's great, but you've got to square that circle of what's the kind of organizational and institutional instantiation of industrial policy that wouldn't result in an orgy of ineffectiveness and corruption. And I think that's a really tough problem that we need to, hit square on. It's not, oh, it's okay to do industrial policy again. We're doing industrial policy now with a much more sophisticated lens on the appropriate institutions that it would take in order for that to be effective, right?
Okay, but I saw this is what I said.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just emphasizing that you said both, right? Because I worry that people love to hear one and not the other.
Okay.
People love to hear industrial policy's okay again. Wow, boom, we're back in business, right? The government's back in business. We can, do what we used to do, and which we love to do for a variety of reasons that were both good and bad. So I'm agreeing that's what you said. I'm always on the worry about institutional, organizational capability end of the debate within the Kennedy School. So I'm always sensitive that people hear both messages.
Thank you, Lant. There was a question about ideology. Professor Milini asked about issues of whether industrialization is only about producing things and whether we could think a little bit broader than that. Professor Baregu talked about entry point. Where do we get in for a country like this one? Now, we won't necessarily answer all these questions. We'll have a lot of opportunities out there to network. But what I would like us to do, from Francois coming back to Sutton in that order, if you can answer in a very short way and then conclude, because we want to close this session. Thank you.
I think that the questions which were asked, the comments which were made are very relevant, and they raise very important questions. Maybe I will be a little more pessimistic than John has been, but I think that because there is an issue of deindustrialization at the global level, because the world is becoming richer, we know there is something called the angle law in economics, meaning that there will be less demand for several goods, including manufactured goods. So this is something that we have to take into account. Second, we have to take into account the technical progress which is taking place and which is very much saving on labor. Because of that, I don't think that we can rely on the model which has been the dominant model of development over the last 25 years, which is the export-led, labor-intensive industrialization model. It is not clear that this will be the model of the future. And because of that, I completely agree with the fact that the point may not be to produce more goods. We need to create jobs in some other areas. We need to be able, in any country, to seize all the opportunities that may appear, but to rely on a model, on the standard model today, may not be the right strategy.
So I think we maybe have been using the word industrialization as a metaphor rather than in a concrete sense. So I think the question for Tanzania is, how are you going to raise the productivity of Tanzanians? Part of the raising the productivity of Tanzanians is going to be embed them in activities in which productivity can be raised. And that's going to involve shifting people from low productivity activities to high productivity activities. A traditional way in which that has been encapsulated is industrialization, moving from low productivity, small scale, sort of agriculture and retail into higher productivity activities. I agree that there's a huge array of activities, and that when we say industrialization, we shouldn't limit ourselves to, leather and textiles and light machinery, the things that are highlighted in that strategy target behind. We should be very broad about saying what's the range of those activities that into which Tanzanians can embed their labor in a higher productivity way. But it is overall a shift from low productivity into high productivity activities. And I think you can be tactical about that. And I think Francois raises legitimate fears that sort of the embedding of low-skilled labor into kind of exclusively manufacturing products is maybe a limiting vision of that. That said, I don't think the delinking, again, that was an idea people had, and if you look at it and said, would we rather have had Tanzania's performance or Korea's, Tanzania's performance or Thailand's, Tanzania's performance or Indonesia's, Tanzania's performance or any of the countries that systematically took the link strategy, I think the de-link strategy failed then. I think the de-link strategy will fail now. And so even if it's not particularly industrial products, you still want to ask yourself, what can I embed Tanzania, what activities can I embed Tanzanian labor in that will be higher productivity, lead to higher incomes for Tanzanians, and to which Tanzania can successfully sell to the rest of the world, because ultimately to be a sophisticated linked economy, you have to generate a flow of foreign exchange resources in order to finance the imports you need to have the levels of investment you need to sustain growth. So ultimately you have to say, what can we sell to the rest of the world that embeds Tanzanian labor? Maybe it's not narrowly conceived industry, and we can think of IT and education and health, but you still have to think, how do we sell this successfully to the rest of the world?
Yeah, so for me, the key is always learning. And so taking the sectors where Tanzania has been revealed to have some comparative advantages, revealed to be able to sell something, and then start moving up into more and more sophisticated versions of that activity. That seems to me to be the strategy. I think that often starts with garments and food processing and simple electronics. It doesn't have to be that. I totally agree. But one just has to think about how you can move up into more and more, sort of up the value chain. I would call, and that is going to require education. I agree with that comment as well. But there isn't going to be a simple recipe. Like, we couldn't come up here and say, this sector is going to work. One also has to be sort of continuous improvement, or continually trying to learn and move up the chain.
I want to join together two of the questions because they add up to the following query. If you're starting from the pattern of economic and industrial activity you have in Tanzania, how should we go forward? What should we do? What industries can we have? And the other side of the coin was the question which asked, shouldn't we be looking at what Tanzanians actually need? Shouldn't we be looking at those industries or those activities that produce things that are useful and socially contribute to the welfare of people in the country? So let me join together the two faces of that query. Let me remark that I was in Kenya 2 days ago, looking at their industrial policy, looking at where they're coming from, looking at their view of the matter. And their view of the matter coincided exactly with mine, which said that, look, this is opportunistic. We have huge numbers of young people coming into their 20s over the next decade. They'll want jobs. It's not as if we have to decide, let's have either this or that. If we had full employment, if we had lots of jobs for everyone, we'd have to decide, hey, should we be making clothing and textiles for the international market, or should we take all the young people out of that activity and have them doing something more socially useful, or have them doing the production of goods that will be consumed locally? That would be a choice that would exist under those hypothetical circumstances, but those aren't the circumstances in which we operate. We operate with vast and increasing youth unemployment, which means that you've got to do everything. You've got to take all the opportunities that exist. You've got to work on every margin. You've got to say yes to the international textile company, but also you have to say yes to every opportunity to develop good local firms that produce good local products and services that will contribute to welfare locally. Do all of those things. Try to get anything that works. You're looking for any capable organization that can absorb young people into good jobs. Kenya wants to work on both margins, which is the model of good industrial policy, that you look short-term and long-term. The clothing and textile companies are for the next 10 years. They're to absorb lots of people into jobs fast. But Kenya is also looking to Volkswagen. They're looking to auto components. They're saying, yes, but we could do that too in 10 years' time. In other words, they're saying, yes, we do have a narrow industrial base. Yes, we are starting from a limited set of basic industries, but our ambitions are both short-term and long-term. In the short term, we're going to get more people into those industries and get lots of jobs. But we're also cognizant of the fact that 10 years down the road, those opportunities will not have given us all that we need in terms of job creation. We need to be getting Volkswagen in here because that's the seed corn that in 10 years' time will mean that we could actually have an auto component sector in Tanzania or in Kenya that will produce jobs that those clothing and textiles firms of today will not produce for us. Yes, the world is changing. Whenever I meet Danny Roderick, he gets me in the corner and he says, yeah, but John, look at my numbers, look at this graph, look how world manufacturing is shrinking. And I say, Danny, yes, you're very far-sighted. 50 years from now, this will be a big problem. I'm not going to be around. For the next 10, 20 years, Chinese clothing firms are trying to shift their locus of production for the next generation towards some new parts of the world which could be here. Why say no to a gift horse? You might as well take the jobs.
Wow, what a way to conclude this session. Let's take all opportunities that come our way. Thank you very much, and may you give a big round of applause to our panelists who have been very good. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the rest of you for being here. You have been with us and very patient. Thank you very much. We are going to hand over the session to Blandina. Thank you.